Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's webinar. My name is George Magnus. I'll be the moderator this morning, and I'm going to hand it over to Errol Ferris from the SCPC, who will be introducing this morning.
Thank you, Georgia. Hello, everyone. Good morning. I am Errol Ferris, Vice President of Industry Affairs at SCPC. I want to thank everyone, first of all, for making the time this morning to take part in today's webinar. As some of you know, some of our key initiatives at SCPC are focused on increasing what we call true collaboration opportunities as an industry with the trade, and also assessing the relevancy of emerging trends that we hear globally, and really trying to assess the relevancy of those to our market here in Canada. So I would like to introduce Ilya Bahar at PricewaterhouseCoopers, who will kick off this morning's session, and which will provide us with some great insights into what is happening in the world of supply chain from a global point of view. Now, most of you already know Ilya Bahar. He's a great friend of our industry. Ilya is currently helping us, our supply chain team, on a few key initiatives such as the supply chain KPI scorecard that we kicked off last year, and is also currently helping us shape a thought leadership session with senior supply chain executives from both manufacturers and retailers. Ilya is a strategic partner for us at the SCPC, and I would like to thank him for what I know will be a great session this morning. So Ilya, over to you.
Thank you, Errol. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining PwC's Consumer Products Strategic Supply Chain Management presentation, led by Joseph Roussel, who I will introduce shortly. This presentation will feature findings from Joseph's book and why strategic supply chain management is important to consumer product goods companies. My name is Ilya Bahar, as you heard. I'm PwC Canada's National Retail and Consumer Consulting Leader, and I will be hosting today's webinar. Before we begin the session, I have a few reminders. We will be recording this session today, and we'll make it available on our website, and I'll give you more information later on. And also, to ensure you can hear today's webinar properly, please make sure that your volume is turned all the way on your computer as well as on the webinar console. At any point during the presentation, please feel free to submit a question by typing it into the chat window that you will see on the lower right-hand side of your screen, and then hitting the send button. We'll attempt to answer as many questions as possible throughout the presentation and during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Now, I'd like to introduce to you today's speaker, Joseph Roussel. Joseph is a partner in our PwC France office in the strategy and operations practice. He also co-authored a best-selling book, which is in its second edition, titled Strategic Supply Chain Management, which he will speak about today. Joseph was born and raised in the United States and has spent 29 years in Europe, where he has advised U.S., European, and Asia-based multinationals in how to use operations to drive growth and achieve greater efficiency. Joseph joined PwC about 3 years ago when the consulting firm that he worked for joined PwC. A company called PRTM was also known for having developed SCORE, the supply chain reference model, which is widely used globally by supply chain organizations like the Supply Chain Alliance. Joseph participated in the development of SCORE, and he will refer to it today during the presentation. We're excited to have Joseph join us today to speak about his perspectives on supply chain issues facing CPG companies. I will now hand it over to Joseph.
Ilya, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm excited to be here today and to share some insights from the book. And I'd like to start by giving a bit of an overview about what do we mean by strategic supply chain management, and also give a little bit of an overview about the book. I'm not here to sell books, but I think it's important to explain what this book is about. We wrote a first edition back in 2005. It sold very well, but supply chain management has moved so far in the last 5 to 6 years that we felt compelled to write a second edition. There's just been a lot of external changes in the economy, and a lot of competitive and technological changes that require us to rethink what we mean by supply chain management. And one of the things we'll be talking about today is how leading companies are successful in supply chain management. We spent a lot of time while writing the book interviewing 6 companies, I'll mention some of them, BASF, Schlumberger, Haier, those types of companies, to find out how they were using the supply chain to be leaders in their industries. And each of the companies we've spent time with is a leader in their industry, and they have a fairly unique spin on supply chain, and we'll be talking a bit about that today. So what I'd like to start on right now is a hypothesis that strategic supply chain management is more important than ever, mainly because of the changes in the external environment. And when I think from a CPG perspective, I believe the same thing is true. All of these pressures, whether they be a war for talent or increasing costs of production, are putting a lot of pressure on companies and their supply chains and making supply chain management more challenging. But I would also say strategic supply chain management. What do we mean by that, strategic supply chain management? What we mean is using the supply chain to drive forward the business strategy and not limiting our view of supply chain as simply an efficiency lever. That's going to be a key thing we'll be coming back to during today's webcast. In terms of, I don't need really to tell CPG companies why supply chain is more important than ever. In terms of consumer concerns, corporate responsibility, food miles, quality, food security, all of these things have become incredibly important for consumers. More importantly, this information and their perceptions of such are widely shared in social media on a day-by-day, hour-by-hour basis. Conclusion of all that is supply chain capability has become part of the brand. So it's not a small concern in leading CPG companies. So I'd say that the strategic supply chain management message has been heard in CPG companies. The question companies are asking is what to do. That's what we'll be talking about in a few minutes. If I look further into some recent studies done by, this is not in the book, but recent studies done by PwC, our CXO survey, our CEO survey that we do once a year, this was released a few weeks ago in Davos, Switzerland, shows that CPG CEOs are working on a number of topics. What I found interesting is supply chain, in terms of the number of companies actively underway or completing programs, the percent of those companies working on supply chain is equal to those working on R&D and innovation, which shows that even though product and service innovation remains very important, supply chain is seen as equally so by CPG players. And then a quick look at another survey that we did last year, which is more focused on supply chain. You know, the usual suspects are in the list of most important concerns of consumer goods respondees. No surprises there. We see cost, profitability, and service up at the top. Biggest point I would like to make in this section is what are leaders doing in terms of benefits they're expecting from the supply chain? Clearly, they keep a very strong focus on efficiency. I mentioned efficiency earlier. They have much higher profitability than the non-best-in-class companies. And that's coming from a very strong focus on efficiency. But I believe most importantly is the double focus they have on top-line growth. And this focus on using the supply chain to drive revenue is really characteristic of the leading companies that we profile in the book. And I think these numbers speak for themselves. We can't neglect efficiency, but if we're not using the supply chain to drive top-line growth, we really miss something in terms of our vision of supply chain management. So I'd like to move on a little bit to the meat of the discussion today, which is how are leaders actually achieving this performance advantage? That's the main topic we're going to be looking at today. Probably before going there, I should refer to what do we mean by supply chain. And Ilya referred to the supply chain operations reference model. Yes, it shows my age. I was on the team that developed the model. But one of the things we learned is that there are some core processes there, execution processes like source, make, deliver, return. Also, the processes needed to make sure we have the right resources in the right place, inventory, for example. So the whole plan component. And then something you don't see here, which is enable, which is all those enabling things like having the right data, having risk management, having supplier development, all those enabling processes which really are critical. Key message here, we need to have a holistic view of the supply chain, but we also need to make sure we don't get it confused with the value chain. And what I see with leading companies is they integrate that supply chain with product and service development. They integrate with finance. They integrate that with other major parts of the company to really drive and make a difference. So my message here today isn't become a supply chain champion. It's you need to use your supply chain to drive forward your strategy. To do that, yes, you need a holistic view of what is the supply chain scope. More importantly, you need to integrate that with other parts of your organization, including product and service development, including marketing and sales, including these other areas. So key message there. So let's dive into the 5 core disciplines which form the bulk of the book. And what are those disciplines? First of all, having a supply chain strategy, discipline 1. Secondly, what we call an end-to-end process architecture, clearly with the right data and systems underneath. Third, designing your organization appropriately. Fourth, building the right collaborative model. People often ask me, why in the world do you consider collaboration a standalone discipline? Well, I think most of us would understand that in the consumer packaged goods world, we have collaboration challenges not only internally and not only with retail, but also with potential other CPG companies. And we'll be talking about that, about how companies are increasingly pooling assets, warehousing, transportation. So collaboration is a major theme in most industries, particularly so in CPG. And then finally, driving a lot of the right behaviors and understanding what really matters and how we're doing versus that with consumers really requires a set of measurements. And happy to hear that Ila is working on a scorecard, subject near and dear to my heart. We'll be talking about that in more detail. So before we dive into each of the disciplines, just wanted to reflect a little bit on what I see globally in terms of specific challenges that are going to have an impact on how CPG companies address these disciplines. First of all, retailer expectations for efficiency. This is no news, but at the same time, because of the factors we talked about earlier, corporate social responsibility, food safety, et cetera, there's a much greater push for end-to-end supply chain management. So our retailer telling our CPG company, what do you have in place to make sure that supply chain is locked down? So more and more functionality required with more and more pressure on cost. So that's a big challenge. Secondly, we see retail consolidation in a number of markets with companies buying up their competitors, but at the same time we see a fragmentation with more and more smaller players coming in attacking niche markets. Quite a challenge there. Consumer demand for multi-channel capability. I'm not here to preach the good news about multi-channel capability, and I think some of it's quite overblown, but the reality is that there are consumers out there. Specific food is a question mark. We'll be talking about that. But in a lot of consumer packaged goods areas, consumers are definitely asking for multi-channel capability that they're just not seeing today. And then finally, overall, an increased pace of innovation in retail supply chain. And by innovation, I mean innovation in the supply chain, not just product and service innovation, but innovation in how we take orders and how we deliver product and how we deal with our customers at point of sale online. And this increased pace of innovation is certainly putting quite a bit of pressure on retail and consumer supply chain. So let's get into the details here of the different disciplines. And I'm going to go fairly quickly so I can have a bit of a chat with Ilya because we have a few questions I think we're going to go over. First discipline, view your supply chain as a strategic asset. And what do we mean by this? Well, we believe that a company, to be successful versus its competition, needs to pick a primary basis of competition that it organizes its operations around. And we recognize 4 of those. And I think there's quite a bit of difference between a supply chain that's focused on innovation and getting the latest products to market quickly, and which is focused on cost. That doesn't mean that we can neglect one of these. It means we need to pick the one we want to excel at so that we can optimize our operations around that. And in terms of what we see from leading companies, and I'd like to focus on one of these, aligning your supply chain with this business strategy and primary basis of competition is a major point. And I'd like to illustrate that with something that's not food related. It's a luxury menswear company. They take orders in the U.S., they have their fabrics made in Italy, their garments made in China, and their view is that it's possible to offer a custom-made suit experience at a very reasonable price. And how do they actually do that? Well, the customer will order online. They have a person coming to see the customer to finalize the measurements. The production has been launched in China. There's delivery to customer, but followed up with a style consultant meeting the customer. This is a very high-touch integrated model, which is really focused around customer experience. It's certainly cost conscious versus a German street experience, but it is all about customer experience, and it puts the right mixture of technology and high touch together to offer that customer experience. Just an example here.
So, Joseph, just on this issue, I know that the example is not CPG is. I would like to ask you about your views on going direct, CPG companies going direct to the consumer. In Canada, our online grocery business is less than 1% of total retail sales. In Europe, cases like the UK is 8%. They made much more progress on that. And the question in Canada obviously is logistics. The supply chain in Canada is much tougher from a food distribution perspective. However, on the other hand, CPG companies, by doing some of the things you have on the slide, by differentiating, being experiential and so on, could achieve success in this area. So what are your perspectives on CPG companies going direct without creating channel conflict?
Well, I think it's really down to what I was talking about earlier, which is what's your fundamental business strategy, and how are you going to interact with that customer. And what we see in Europe, the strong growth in CPG companies going direct is primarily specialist manufacturers. So we have a whole, if you look across Europe, whether it's France, Italy, Germany, we see companies that are very recognized as being the expert in a certain food product, processed food product. And they have a rural following, and they're basically going direct. You will also see those products in supermarkets, but they basically sell a bulk of their product direct to consumers. And the reason they're able to do that is they're considered to be the premium brand for what they're selling, and they manage to nurture over the years a direct relationship with the consumer already. These are companies that typically started off with catalog sales, to be very bold about it, and they have direct. They also have opened up their own urban retail outlets. And one example is a seafood processor, which is a very big operation in France. They've been selling over the years catalog, now it's online. They've now opened up in Paris and other major cities a store. You can actually go in and buy their products. But they have a very loyal following because they are the best at what they do. So I think, the question really is, do you have that brand equity that is so appealing to a consumer that they want to have a direct relationship with you? I think if you already have that value proposition, you can go in this direction. If you don't, it's really hard to build. Anyway, just a quick view on that. And one quick comment on this area as well in terms of strategy. We see more and more customers driving change. The leading retailers really creating more and more tailored in-store assortments. I see this across Europe. Before we had fairly generalist retail food retailers. We see more and more smaller format stores in city centers, which have a heavily, I hate to use the word curated, although it would appeal to museums, there's heavily curated selection. Really, and they have clearly studied the demographic that's going to come into that outlet. And I guess the question is, given this multiplication of different formats, how's a CPG company to respond to that? It really is putting some pressure there on the logistics front. The second discipline, end-to-end process architecture. We talked a little bit earlier that supply chain isn't the only core enterprise process. There are others, but what's really critical is making sure that architecture encompasses the key processes. And as I mentioned earlier, making sure that it's integrated, that we're not sitting here saying supply chain, we've integrated the supply chain, but now it's a little kingdom. No, the real question is, how's that supply chain team going to work with the marketing and sales team, with the product development team? How are those folks really working together? And one of the things that I see here in terms of process pressure is the whole question of multi-channel. And we'll come to that in just a minute. I would like to take an example about the fallacy of adopting best practices. A lot of us talk about best practice. We have an example in the book of a global online retailer that has an enormous selections of products, but in reality, most of them are not stocked by the company. It's an online retailer. In terms of best practice, we were taught that the best practice is to give an exact delivery date. Exact delivery date. This company never does that. They give estimates and then they provide proactive updates. But why do consumers keep buying from this company? Well, they keep buying from them because they figured out the best selection in competitive prices trumps exact delivery slots. So this company is using that fluidity on delivery spots to optimize their own logistics costs, right? So what I'm trying to point out here isn't that this is the best model for distribution, but that this company has figured out what's really best in terms of best practice based on its total value proposition. And that's really important. One point I'd like to make about process in CPG now is this multi-channel pressure that we see, particularly in Europe right now, where we really need to have three things. We need to have high physical availability of product. If not, we need to have incredibly good inventory visibility. And lastly, we need to have this last mile delivery capability. When we start looking at that, that changes fundamentally what has been a push model in food distribution in Europe, where we're basically bringing products into distribution centers, moving them to other stocking locations, perhaps directly to store. It's basically a big push model. Now all of a sudden, we need to be able to provide visibility on inventory. Do we have it? Do we not have it? Where is it? And this is a fundamental change in process and underlying data. And it's really scaring the pants off of people in terms of the level of investment. And I think it really forces us to ask ourselves how we want to play in that area and how much of this is real business we're going to generate and how much of it is just hype. Because the amount of process and IT work potentially coming out of this multi-channel model is significant. Moving on to the core discipline 3, which is designing your organization for performance. We talk about a lot of things in the book, but my personal conviction is it's the organization and people part that really distinguishes the true leaders versus those who want to be leaders. And why is that? Because what really drives companies to be leaders in an industry is culture and capability. Culture and capability take time to develop, typically multiple years. You don't suddenly change that by putting a new IT system in place. And what we saw with all the leading companies in the book is they worked an awful lot on culture and capability. And in terms of the supply chain organization, they really thought through how that supply chain organization would be customer focused. And there's this point that I just mentioned the question of talent mix, because talent's a big issue today in supply chain. But then what I'd like to focus on here are different options when it comes to creating the supply chain structure. And I'd like to take an example from a CPG company here. They have over 400 brands focused on health and well-being, very large setup. When they first started out, they had a completely decentralized operation. Everything was being done by region. And what they sat around the table and said, how can we really create some efficiencies, but keep a focus on two other things. Innovation on the one hand, because we need to keep innovating on our products. And then secondly, customer proximity and what matters for customer. And they came up with an organization where they have category vice presidents that are highly focused on product and brand. They have cluster-level operations, and these are operations that are in the theater, in the region, sub-region, that are really focused on the customer orders, the planning, the manufacturing. And they add on top of that a global sourcing and procurement organization to really leverage the scale of what they're able to do procurement-wise, but also to put into place some infrastructure that the customer doesn't necessarily see, like logistics hubs. I think this whole topic of designing your organization is really a critical one. And I'll just make one point on this one, which is we're seeing more and more retailers appointing supply chain directors. That's all they do. And they professionalize the supply chain function so well. I think one of the challenges for many CPG companies is have they followed? Do they have the similar level of leadership, management leadership in supply chain to actually be a real partner with a retailer? Just a question I have. Ilya?
So, you raised quite a number of topics, and I want to ask one of the questions. One of them is around complexity. And I think, when you use that example of curating the assortment in local stores, and as well as this organization, do you see complexity in supply chain increasing as I see it, both number of SKUs, number of channels, complexity of the channels online, and so on? And do you think that the supply chain professionals should resist or support this complexity? And especially linked to the new assortments are going to be so small, so localized, and so on. As a supply chain professional, do you say, hey, this is really going to get our costs out of whack, or do you live with it and create different supply chains for different assortments?
Well, you bring up a really interesting question there, which is what's good complexity and what's bad complexity. So PwC, actually in the book we talk a lot about this because we did some research on complexity. But PwC has done a lot of research on complexity, and I think one of the difficulties is figuring out what complexity is adding value. So I'm going to sidestep the monumental question of SKU proliferation for now because that's a very big question linked to the strategy a company has in terms of how it's positioning itself. And I'd like to get down to a question of pure supply chain complexity, which, by the way, is driven by SKU complexity, but it's also driven by other things, such as do we need to have different planning processes for different formats, for different customers, for different types of channels? Do we need different logistics operations? So I think there are two questions I challenge companies to look at, which is, first of all, the physical footprint. Is it overly complex? Is it something you inherited? Is it something you acquired but you never rationalized? Looking at the physical footprint. And then on top of that, looking at the process, and looking at the tools, and looking at the data, and looking at basic things like data definition. And what we find oftentimes is companies will attack that physical complexity, they will attack the SKU proliferation, but they actually run to the back and ask, how many different planning processes do I really need? How many different logistics processes do I really need? And I think that is a core area that needs to be looked at because, as you mentioned quite rightly, there are more and more formats, and I won't even talk about the pop-up stores and all this stuff, but do you really need a unique process for that? Yes or no? And I think the question of process simplification is a big deal. I mentioned in the organization earlier that leading companies are investing a lot more in this kind of enable talent. People who are doing process definition, data management, risk management. Leading companies actually look at their supply chain payroll, and they look at it in three groups. Execution resources. People are actually doing things like placing purchase orders, managing transportation. They look at planning resources. People are actually figuring out how much do I really need to be ordering in the future with supplier A, or do I need to be delivering with supplier B? And then they look at enable, which is this whole risk management, supplier development, process development area, and they have a lot more headcount in the enable type jobs than you see in the average company. And KPIs and measurement, you'll be happy to hear, is one of the key topics in there. So I hope I answered the question. And I'd like to move on because I know we're under some time pressure. I mentioned collaboration earlier. Collaboration, one of the biggest messages of the book is that you have to pick the right level of collaboration given the relationship you've got. And deep collaboration, which is sort of your CPFR, co-planning, that's deep collaboration. You need to really spend some time. You need to invest in management talent into that. It costs something. But if the business results are there, it's worth it. So figuring out what kind of collaborative relationship you want to have with whom is really critical. And this collaboration, unfortunately, if you're not good at internal collaboration, you're typically not going to be very good at external. So one of the core messages of the book is you really need to figure out internal collaboration. Does that make sense? Well, consider this. If we can't get merchandising and we can't get supply chain to agree on what the most likely demand plan is for a given retailer, how in the world are we going to have a discussion with our own suppliers or with the retailers? So there's a basic challenge here, which is to collaborate internally effectively. We've talked about segmenting the partners because all relationships aren't equal. I won't mention the last point, which I think everyone would agree with in terms of trusting the partners. We have an example in the book that I found very intriguing. Company's recently been bought by one of the world's leading e-retailers. But it was a UK startup which figured out that a lot of consumers want to know exactly when they're going to get delivered. In fact, they like when they buy something in the store to set an exact delivery slot. And this company set up a business where they got the customer to say when they want a delivery. They signed up retailers in a specific given area. And this works more in a urban, catchment area, obviously, than a Canadian, highly distributed, situation. And they also went out and found a local network of same-day couriers. This model is a collaboration business, actually. It's a collaboration business where they set themselves up as an aggregator. And what makes this model work so well is the vetting they've done on the couriers. Can you imagine a courier with a drug record? Can you imagine a courier? So, this is a really powerful example of a collaborative business. I think in terms of CPG collaboration, I'd like to drive home 3 points here. One is internal collaboration is a must-do, but more and more collaboration with retailers. Retailers are expecting CPG companies to come up with ideas for them. Postponement. Can you, this may be more applicable to fashion, but I think it works well for promotional campaigns. Can you do things at the last minute so we're not pushing too much product into the store? What about sourcing strategies? We want more flexibility in our supply chain. Hey, CPG company, the way you set up your own supply chain doesn't allow you to have the flexibility we need to see. So designing your own supply chain to accommodate some outcomes, joint outcomes in terms of inventory and flexibility. Those are all collaborative, but we're also seeing collaboration across CPG companies. More and more concerns primarily linked to the need of the consumer desire to be delivered more frequently. We see more pooling of resources, warehousing resources, transportation resources. There's another form of collaboration within the industry, CPG. So collaboration has become a must-do skill and capability in the industry today. And then finally, going on to the last discipline, measurement, with this increasing focus on innovation in the supply chain, and this is the question I think that Ilya, you raised. These are the measurements that we developed a number of years ago and keep developing with the Supply Chain Council. What are the measurements we need to have in place? And I think there's two big questions there for CPG companies. First of all, how do we make sure we're measuring things to support these collaborations we just talked about? Like, how do we make sure we're not sub-optimizing? And I think also there's a challenge, and Ilya, you're probably working on this right now, which is what's the right KPIs by channel?
Yeah.
So you may have some points there you'd like to raise.
Exactly on this exact point. So customers with their cloud, let's say retailers, because they have significant cloud in Canada, where are very concentrated the retail market, may choose to measure one or two of these measures. And the question here is, if you measure one, let's say case to weight, are you sub-optimizing the entire supply chain because the suppliers may have to increase inventory levels to achieve the target and so on? So are we losing anything in the overall supply chain or value chain, end-to-end, farm to fork, by focusing on one or other KPIs as opposed to the entire supply chain? This is one of the topics that I think this industry is really concerned about and discussing, as you heard at the beginning.
One message I'd like to get across on this topic, Ilya, is that, and it's something that we actually see at the top of this page, which is measuring from the customer's perspective. Obviously, you should have written consumer perspective expectation. One of the biggest issues we see in the industry in terms of measurement is, are we all focused on the same outcome? And I think your question is, are we just measuring a small activity, a small point in time in that supply chain? Are we really measuring what matters for the consumer? And I think that when you have a retailer and a CPG company sitting down and saying, what really matters to the consumer is X, how are we going to measure that? I think we're going to be asking the right question and going in the right direction. When I have a retailer sitting there saying, what can you do just to reduce the inventory level down, and that's all they want to talk about, very frankly, I don't think you're going to be driving forward yourselves. That's the way it is, right? And we know that retailers have very different mentalities. There are some which are quite, willing to collaborate, and there are others who basically just want to squeeze the next penny.
Well, we keep on hearing that in Europe there is more collaboration between retailers and CPG. I don't know if you experience the same as maybe in North America. Is that really the case? That it is more end-to-end supply chain thinking in Europe and it is in North America?
I wish I could say that I was an expert in everything going on in North America, but it's not true. But I would say that it is about being realistic about your power position in the supply chain. And this is a topic that I raised fairly early on in the book, which is if we don't understand our relative power position, there are things that we're going to try to do that are just never going to happen, right? So if you are in Nestle, you can do certain things that others can't. In Europe, I think there is, it depends on the national market because, as you know, we have fairly consolidated retail in some countries more than others. But it's about your power position. I think the question I always raise to any company in the industry is your power position is low and you're unable to negotiate commercial arrangement, including the supply chain, which makes sense for your business. You really need to figure out how to adjust that power position. And there are ways of doing that in terms of working with other customers. So this is a question. So I can't really tell you they're better at collaboration. I've seen a number of very well-functioning collaborative relationships. I've seen a number of very dysfunctional ones. I mean, my advice would be if your power position is too weak with the reseller and you're really not going to be able to make progress from a collaboration perspective, go back to the collaboration spectrum that I showed earlier and really focus on just optimizing what I would call the transactional relationship. And don't waste time on it. Go work with those resellers who are going to help drive forward your business. Invest in those. And I think that's the reality. So thank you for that question, Leo. And so we talked about the disciplines, but one of the things that we haven't talked about is actually deploying all this stuff and actually making change happen. And one of the things we saw in the book is that the leaders in the different industries that I talked about have a very different view and behavior when it comes to transformation. One of the key things that is different in these companies is that when you go and ask them, can we talk about how you're using the supply chain to drive forward your business strategy? It's interesting who they actually introduce you to. They don't introduce you simply to the COO or the supply chain director. They introduce you to the head of marketing, the head of sales. They introduce you to the head of product development. So that was the typical behavior of the ASF, the Essilors, the Swinburne. So I found that very interesting. And what it means is their viewpoint is that the management team needs to be aligned about how to use the supply chain to drive forward the strategy. What I found interesting looking at the CXO survey, because we have some data there about how many companies are actually working today on supply chain. About 50% of the companies are still thinking about it. I found that interesting. So a lot of companies are still in the planning and organizing phases, not in the make it happen phase. And I think that may be because they really haven't gotten that shared view in the management team about how to use the supply chain to drive forward the business strategy. Just a hypothesis there. And then the other thing that we see with the leading companies is they really manage a portfolio of change initiatives. They certainly don't neglect what we call continuous improvement. I have that at the bottom here, supply chain improvement. They're very, very focused on year-on-year performance improvements. They ask the head of logistics, they ask the head of merchandising, they ask all these folks, what can you do to be more efficient? So they're very focused on efficiency, but they also have efforts which are focused on what we call supply chain excellence, which is really breakthroughs that are going to position themselves competitively. And occasionally, they have what we would call supply chain innovation. And supply chain innovation is a very big deal because it's about changing the way things are done in your industry. These things don't happen every year, but we have good examples of them. And I think this portfolio of figuring out what you're focusing on, making sure you're not drowning in the supply chain improvement arena. And oftentimes, you'll go to a CPG company and say, what are you guys doing in terms of supply chain? What are your breakthroughs? And you find out that they have 250 supply chain improvement initiatives. They've launched this massive Six Sigma program that they're drowning in continuous improvement. The reality is, in any organization, there's only so much management bandwidth to focus on change. You need to make sure you're balancing it between continuous improvement and other more game-changer types of change. And this focus is fairly typical of your leading companies in terms of how they manage change. So, in conclusion, before we go into Q&A, strategic supply chain management really is a very different mindset. It's not just an efficiency play. It's about how to make sure the supply chain is driving forward your business strategy. And it's also about making change happen. Because these leading companies are really good at deployment. They are really good at implementation. They've got that implementation thing down. And what we see through the book and through our other studies is using the supply chain strategically can enable superior performance in industry leadership. I will finish with a footnote. If no one wants to buy your products, you can have the best supply chain in the world. It doesn't matter. Therefore, you need to have a competitive offering. You need to have stuff people want to buy. But if you meet that condition and you really approach the supply chain strategically, you can attain industry leadership. I'd like to stop with that.
Thank you very much, Joseph. I would like to take some of the questions that were raised by the audience online. And the one I would like to talk about is the disruptive technologies. You mentioned a lot of things this morning, collaboration, organization, strategic supply chain. How do you see, is there any disruptive technology that's going to change the way we execute supply chain today? What do you see out there which could really change significantly the way we're thinking about supply chain?
Well, we're not really using the technologies we've had since the last 10 years very well. I mean, to be honest with you. So, we keep talking about big data and data analytics, but what are we actually doing with that data, right? So, another example comes to mind. The internet boom started over 2 years ago. We obsessed massively about getting consumers ordering on the internet. We spent hundreds of millions creating capability where people could order, and it's only in the last 12 to 24 months that we started talking about click and collect. So I think there's a big gap between the technology-driven view of the world and the reality of what's going on. So I think the time has come where we need to sort of, we've got a lot of technology out there. We really need to figure out what technology we need to actually drive value and differentiate versus the competition. If you ask me what's the most disruptive technology out there today, strangely enough, I would say it's social media. And why is it so disruptive? And I use the word disruptive, maybe not technologically disruptive, but supply chain disruptive, because supply chain failures today are so propagated so quickly that they're crippling. When we have an incident, whether it's a food safety incident or a delivery failure, everyone knows about it. And people are buying more and more based on recommendations of their peer groups and their social groups. So I think that has just changed supply chain fundamentally. And people are still struggling, managers are still struggling with the implications of this. Their view of the speed that they need to react in is just not.
Just linked to this, you just reminded me, we're launching actually a global survey this Wednesday called Photo Retail, and it includes Canadian consumers' views about online as well, and we're comparing Canadian consumers to the rest of the world. Most of the kind of comments that you get from consumers today are related to supply chain when it comes to online. It's interesting. Huge, like you said, a huge following on social media. All the research is done on social media, especially for large purchases. But also on the delivery, the fulfillment side. People want to see the inventory, like you said before. Is it available? Where is it available? Online, in the store, which store? How can I receive it? Can you deliver it at home? We're going to see a future where I think it's really a one-to-one conversation, where I could order a product perhaps and get it delivered from my office or pick it on the subway or at home at 10 in the morning or 10 at night. I think it's going to be a much more dynamic kind of conversation between the brands, the retailers, and the consumers.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I mean, some of the statistics from our web buyer survey, which we conducted last year, showed that 56% of the 15,000 people that were, polled across the world prefer going to a store, buying in a store, and picking it up. So the question is, okay, that's 56, not 99, right? 56. But so there's still quite a few who are interested. But the statistic that really shocked me is I looked in France at the French numbers, and only 16% of the people polled really use online for food. 16%. And they're occasional. They're not every week. So, and that's why I think, retailers particularly need to really take a hard look at, how much they want to dedicate to, the multi-channel world and what that's really going to add as value. Because, my own personal perspective is that for the whole offering in the store may not be relevant for all consumers. And I think there's some thinking to do there. There's some real thinking to do there. But it's an exciting thing. But once again, anything that's technology-led tends to get us in trouble. And I'll give a recent example. In France, a leading cosmetics company decided to deploy Apple tablets to all of the salespeople, mostly young ladies, right? The goal was to advise customers about what the right cosmetics were, show them the products, give them, within about 4 months, all of the tablets were basically put in the storehouse because they had not trained the person on the floor how to actually engage with the customer. So we had this technology-led idea that actually it should have been all sales assistant-led, right? How can you add more value? Do you want to? Because a lot of these salespeople didn't want to do that. They didn't want to advise. They didn't want. So once again, we see the human component coming out there. If you want to provide service, it starts with someone actually wanting to be service-oriented. the tool was an enabler for that. And I think the question for a retailer, I know we have a lot of CPG companies, not retailers, but what kind of service are you actually providing? Have you actually talked to those consumers to understand what they're really looking for? I think that is scary because you need to go in and segment those consumers again. You really need to understand where it's really going to matter. So I don't think one global approach to the consumer base is a smart idea coming from a retail perspective.
No, I agree with 100%. I think many retailers are looking for a reason to have a conversation with consumers in the store. Many retail interactions are really dry. You go for the product, you pick it, you put it in the cart, you go out. And they need to create those conversations to engage the consumers. So if you just give somebody a tablet or an iPhone or whatever without that deep understanding of what is it that you're talking about, it won't work. I agree 100%. Okay, well, maybe you have covered this already. There's another question here. What is the most significant organizational hurdles that CPG companies are facing to get to the next level in supply chain effectiveness? An organizational question.
I did mention a bit this question about collaboration. I do think that a lot of CPG companies, I'm not talking about the most advanced ones, but a lot of them have taken a long time to professionalize the supply chain function. Today, there is quite a competition for supply chain talent. I don't know if you saw this, but about 6 months ago, a recent Wall Street Journal survey indicated that the highest specialized MBA in the U.S. was supply chain management. So there's such a pull to get people who are supply chain management capable into companies, and CPG companies like others are competing for that talent. Clearly, they can also grow their own, but to get to where they need to be, they probably need to recruit as well. So I think this talent question is one, and then above all, this ability to understand the end-to-end supply chain, and that requires some serious teaming across the company. I mentioned earlier, how do you get the different teams of your company working together? I think getting the incentives in place is really what it's all about. Because if you think of the tremendous cost pressure a lot of CPG companies are in, it's quite easy, once again, to put that operations supply chain team in a little box and say, your major job is cost improvement. But is that really the only job they got to do? So I think that collaboration across the company is a fundamental challenge and a priority.
Well, I don't think we have any other questions, Joseph. Thank you very much for your insights and sharing with us what you saw both in Europe and North America in terms of strategic supply chain. It's definitely a topic that this industry is interested in. And the industry wants to step away from the day-to-day preoccupations of supply chain, which tend to be more tactical, and kind of step back and say, where are we going? Where are we going to be as an industry in 5 or 10 years from now? Where should we invest or not invest? So I think your insights were very useful. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our presentation today. Those of you in attendance will receive a copy of the book. I think we'll probably organize it with Errol's team at the FCPC. I think we did cover all the questions that were submitted online. The recording of this webinar will be made available on our Canadian website. We will search it PwC Canada, and we'll be able to PwC Canada Retail maybe, and we'll be able to get access in case other people would like to listen to the recording as well. And as I said, this Wednesday we are launching this Total Retail Global Survey, a Canadian finding as well. This is consumer views on retailing, and we do refer to grocery retail as well in terms of what people think about buying online or researching online. So thanks again for joining us today. Have a good day.
And thank you for the invitation, Errol. And Ilya, thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph.